Can it be? My YouTube fam? We're back together? Good morning to you, everybody. Man, have I missed you guys. It's been an eventful 2 weeks for me, and I have, had my hands full over here, but I've missed grade school and so glad to be back with you. I'm a little sleep deprived. I'm real excited. I've been having a crazy time getting to know my kid, who we brought into the world on January 27th. And before we get into all the exciting stuff that we have to talk about today, I thought y'all might want to meet the newest member of my family. Come here, kiddo. She is out like a light right now. Everyone say hello to Bridget Bear Kelly. I think everyone can see her pretty good, right? Can you see everybody? Can you see everybody? Yeah. I'll have to flip it over and that's fine. I got her in the frame. So there she is, my pride and joy. This is the reason why we didn't get to do this session a couple weeks ago. Good reason. Now we got her safely home. We're happy, we're healthy, we're safe, we're comfortable. Thanks to all of you guys who sent out so many nice thoughts and well wishes when we were bringing this little one into the world. It's much appreciated, and you guys have made me feel very special in this crazy time. So thanks, guys. And that's Bridget.
Oh, like Jim said, she looks like a doll.
Okay, Mommy, here you go. Okay. Babies aside, we got some stuff to cover today. Let's get into it. My buddy Raf is here with me. He's going to help me keep us organized with questions, which I think we're going to have a lot of. And this is the first grade school in this sort of new format that we've been talking about, where we are going to be oriented around sort of following up on the video that we did for DaVinci Wide Gamut, part 1. So we're going to be focusing on answering your questions and filling in any blanks you have on that subject that we covered in that video. And we got lots to cover, so let's get right into it. Before we do, just a couple of other announcements I want to share with you guys. So first up, we have just bundled together all of these different freebies and assets that I've been hooking you guys up with so far this year. The exposure chart, DCTL, my YouTube frame IO LUT, the mid-grade cheat sheet, the Kodak 2383 LUT. We've bundled all of that together into a starter pack, and the link for that is in the description for this live session. So if you haven't gotten all of those pieces individually yet, go ahead and go grab the starter pack. It's a great way to get it all without having to follow 20 different links. And it's a bunch of cool stuff in there that I think is going to really benefit your workflow, and I'm sure we're going to touch on the use of some of those tools in today's session. So check out that link in the description and go grab that for yourself. My Elements LUT pack has been out for a little bit now. Just wanted to mention that to you guys again. We talked about that in the recorded piece of this video that we're talking about live today. I used 2 LUTs from the Elements LUT pack in that video that went up a couple weeks ago, and got some great results out of it. So the Elements LUT pack is live as well at cullenkellycolor.com, and there's a direct link to it in the description. Go check that out as well if you're looking to get that piece of the puzzle that we talked about in the pre-recorded video of getting a really solid macro level look implemented in a LUT that expects the right color space, returns the right color space, doesn't do anything funky to your image. You know you can trust it. All those good things that sound so simple on the surface that I can tell you from experience, and probably many of you guys can tell me as well, are kind of tricky to come by when you're actually looking for really high quality LUTs. So I encourage you to go check those things out as well. And I've loved hearing feedback from you guys about the Colorist 10 Commandments, my ebook that came out earlier this year. Sounds like everybody's really benefiting from it and enjoying it. And again, this is something that we talked about in the pre-recorded video for this topic this week, or a couple weeks ago rather. We talked about the concept of macro beats micro. That's one of the commandments in the Colorist 10 Commandments. So we're going to be talking more and more about concepts that are coming out of that book. And it's a really great way to follow up on and deepen your knowledge of the things we talk about here on the channel, to actually go through the full corresponding chapter to those topics and get a deeper sense for why I feel these things are so important and what really is at the heart of these concepts that I feel like are the essential 10 concepts for really, really effective color grading. So that's our housekeeping. That's our announcements for the week. Let's get into some questions. I feel like we got a bunch coming in. I'm going to kick it over to Rafa, see what we've got out there.
All right, we have A very good question here. What does the difference between the offset wheels and the global exposure in the HDR palette, and which could be better for true exposure adjustment?
Yes, this is a good question. And we got a number of different variations on this question when this pre-recorded video went live. And I'm glad to see you guys are all paying attention, because we got different variations that include like, oh, well, why wouldn't you use the global exposure in the HDR palette? Or why wouldn't you use a linear tone curve and then apply gain to your image? And for any of you guys who aren't familiar with all the things I'm talking about, the fundamental question is, what is the ideal way to manipulate exposure inside of Resolve? And more pointedly, people have been asking, why are you adjusting exposure in the pre-recorded video for this topic? Let me get my Resolve going on here. The more pointed question has been, why have you been suggesting that we adjust exposure using your offset like this, rather than some other methods that I've talked about in the past, which include global exposure here in my HDR palette, or going into a linear tone curve by going to Gamma and selecting linear, and then instead of adjusting our offset, adjusting our gain. All good questions. And the truth is, these are all good ways to get reasonably photometric exposure adjustments. Why am I using offset? Why am I suggesting offset in this part one of this workflow that we're going through here? It's because offset's the simplest and it's been with us for the longest. And if we think back to the photochemical days and to the color timers that are sort of our forebearers as artists, color timers had offset to work with. They didn't have linear gain. They didn't have true photometric exposure. In fact, what they had was offset, just adding or subtracting red, green, or blue light. It's the simplest and the oldest operator we have available to us. And the truth is, there are advantages that I have discussed in the past to using something like linear gain, or using something like gain applied in a linear tone curve, or using the exposure wheel inside of your high dynamic range palette. But the truth is, they're pretty small gains. They're really for when you have an overall workflow on its feet and you're like, oh, I want to get that extra 5-10% of improvement, or I want to get a more intuitive response, or I want to be able to key things in stops rather than arbitrary numbers. Those are where using these other methods really come into play. In general, offset, like I say, it's the oldest and like simplest form of manipulation of our image, and it does a great job of adjusting exposure. So that's why I am suggesting it in the pre-recorded version, or in the pre-recorded video that we did a couple weeks ago. You could absolutely use global exposure or linear gain if you wanted to, but I'm going to be sticking with offset for now for the sake of this workflow, just because it's simple, it's right there. We don't even have to leave our primaries or move into another tone curve to make use of it, and we're going to get great results out of it. There's no reason we can't do really, really effective grades with an offset wheel applied in our default log container.
All right. Next question from Stefano. I would like to know, using color space transforms, when do we must use apply forward OOTF?
Good question. So we've talked about the OOTF and the inverse, the forward OOTF and the inverse OOTF in prior episodes of grade school a good little bit. And the truth is, to fully unpack, okay, what is OOTF? Spoiler, opto-optical transfer function. And if that sounds kind of tricky, it is a little bit tricky. If we want to really get into the weeds on that we could spend the whole hour talking about that. But here's the important thing to take away from the OOTF in either direction. When you are moving in between a scene space or a camera space and a display space, you are going to want to use the OOTF function. Okay, so for example, if I am color managing, we in this project, which is this is kind of how I left things off in the pre-recorded video, I'm color managing here at the project level. But if I turn my project level color management off for the time being and set my timeline color space to DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, even though that doesn't matter much at the moment, now I'm going to do a manual color management out to Rec709 from DaVinci Wide Gamut. Let's just do this and then I'll fill things in. So I'm going to say DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate. Oh, and I forgot this would now be a two-step color management system. So let's just quickly, this is a fun exercise you guys have seen me do before, but never hurts to take a fresh lap through. I'm just doing a manual version of what we were formerly doing with our color management settings in the project settings. So I'm inputting from Alexa LogC, which is the camera source, into DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. Leaving all of this stuff off, you'll note that I've got my OOTF pieces turned off. And then here at the timeline level, I'm outputting, getting my 709 output, doing DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate to Rec709 Gamut 2.4. And I've got my forward OOTF turned on here. So the rule of thumb is this. When we are going from a camera or a working space, such as DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, into a display space, we want the forward OOTF on. When we are going the opposite direction, from a display space back into a camera or a scene space, we often will want to use the inverse OOTF, although not always. That one's a bit more of a subjective call. Those are the instances where we would want to use either of these pieces. If your use case doesn't fit into that, you want to leave these things off. So for example, here at my clip level, where I'm input mapping from Arri Alexa LogC into DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, I don't want to apply an OOTF in either direction because I'm moving from scene space to scene space, or from camera space to camera space. Same thing. And the good sort of mnemonic you can remember here is the OO. Both of those O's stand for opto, meaning what we see, meaning reproduced, meaning a display. So if a display is not involved either in the source or in the output, we don't need to use an OOTF, which is all about the way we are reproducing on a screen. If there's not a screen involved, as is the case here, this is not about a screen. This is just about moving in between a camera space and a working space. We don't need to do anything to account for the character of the screen that we're going to be going to. That's going to happen later here at the timeline level. So if you're going to, really short answer, if you're going to a display space, turn forward OOTF on. Any other circumstance, you don't necessarily need to do either, although if you're going from a camera space, or rather from a display space back to a camera space, you might try an inverse OOTF and just see if it gives you better results.
All right, let's go to DaVinci with Gamut. Curious about using DaVinci with Gamut in a color space transform node format. I like to use a CST all the way upstream to make all my footage DaVinci with Gamut, and then do my primaries, then looks, and lastly, an output color space transform all the way downstream from DaVinci with Gamut to either Rec709 or ST2084. The one thing I'm really getting stuck on is the tone mapping plus Gamut mapping options within the color space transform OFX. Can you please possibly give me some best practices for that on the input and output color space transform? I feel like I'm just using the DaVinci option and saturation compression to get me where I need quickly and easily, but I feel like that's not a one-size-fits-all options.
Yes, good question. And I like doing things in nodes in my workflows as well. So you guys might have noticed this is actually a question I think that came up, that I'm color managing in the pre-recorded video with the project settings, just to introduce us to the most vanilla form of color management. But I actually like to do things in nodes a lot in my workflows as well. And that's in fact kind of what we teed up in the course of answering our last question is what we heard summarized in this one, where we say we are input mapping from our camera space into our working space, Arri Alexa LogC, DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, like so. And then we're doing whatever grading is going to happen either here or here at the timeline level where I'm doing my look, all the stuff that's happening in between. And then the very last thing, the other bookend, is going to be our output to our display, right? Everybody follow that? So again, this is just spelling out in nodes something that we're already doing in the project settings in the pre-recorded video, where we are navigating or shepherding the image from camera state into working color space and then finally out to display color space. And all we're doing here is making that explicit by doing it in nodes and by placing our look and our grades at the proper point in between those bookends. So the question is, what about all these settings, this tone mapping and this gamut mapping? What's actually driving these behaviors, and how can I better understand them and use them with a bit more like knowledge as opposed to just kind of like doing what works? And it's a great question. So a couple things that we should cover here. we can get different and interesting results. Let me get an input mapping on this image here. I want to actually audition what we're going to do here on this shot because it's a little bit tighter. Let's just look at our character's face. Whoops. Didn't mean to do that. Let's go back to our clip. And we'll do that, okay? So the question is fundamentally about our tone mapping and our gamut mapping. We know what this stuff needs to be, right? This is either wrong or right. I'm either selecting the proper input and going to the proper output, or I'm not. But the question is about this tone mapping and gamut mapping stuff. And thankfully, we already answered our question about this OOTF down here. So we've got a good sense for these settings. We never would want to have forward and inverse turned on at the same time. And white point adaptation, we don't need in this case because we share a common white point between DaVinci Wide Gamut and Rec709. They both have a white point of D65. So let's talk about tone mapping and gamut mapping. Let's actually start with gamut mapping. Gamut mapping, if we are doing a color space transform using Resolve Color Management, gamut mapping is pretty cut and dry. Now, I'll sort of like frame this explanation using an analogy you guys have heard me use many, many times before, that asking me to take a DaVinci Wide Gamut state image and convert it into a Rec709 state image is roughly the equivalent of asking me to take 10 pounds of dirt and place it into a 5-pound sack. I can't. I have more dirt than the sack will accommodate, right? Same idea here. Rec709 is smaller than DaVinci Wide Gamut, so I can't actually fit the full theoretical color volume of DaVinci Wide Gamut into Rec709. And that's what gamut mapping is all about. Gamut mapping says, okay, as my pixel values start to approach the edge of what I can even reproduce with the Rec709 standard, let's get nonlinear with it. Let's start to compress those colors so that we are retaining our overall colorfulness, but we are avoiding clipping things out. And if we look at, you know, the difference between like gamut mapping, this may give us a decent example here, maybe not. Let's turn my look off for a moment as well. And I just want to see if I can find a shot where I can really see the difference in my gamut mapping. You know, I could hunt for it a little bit more, but you can see it certainly on the vector scope here. Look at the red vector here that corresponds to this chair and these washing machines. With my saturation, with no gamut mapping, my red is reaching a little bit further. And with saturation compression turned on, I am compressing that red vector to make sure that it doesn't extrude beyond the bounds of what my Rec709 gamut can contain. Okay, so that's a bit of a theory. That's kind of like the why of what's up with gamut mapping. Why do we need it? What is its purpose? That's what gamut mapping does. Now, there are many very dense textbooks just on the subject of gamut mapping, and I haven't even read them all. There's a lot of literature out there on gamut mapping, a ton of different schemes and algorithms and methods and like approaches that you can take to that problem of how are we going to non-linearly sort of contort our big color volume so that it best is reproduced inside of our smaller color volume. That's a huge field, a huge like discipline within image science. Now, I wanted to start with gamut mapping here in Resolve because we really only have one option here in Resolve. In my opinion, you really don't ever want to choose none for your gamut mapping. If you're going from a large space to a small space, you better be gamut mapping somehow, unless you're cool with clipping, which you shouldn't be. Or if you choose clip, you're basically going to get the same thing. So saturation compression is kind of the way to go here. What's going on under the hood here, the exact math, we actually don't know because that's not published for Resolve. So I would love to know more deeply exactly what math is being used and the particular flavor of gamut mapping being employed, but I can tell you that it does a good job and it looks pretty good. So that would be my default that I would live with here. And you can play with your knee and your max on these settings here. But again, I would say there's not a ton of gold in those hills. You're not going to find a huge benefit to your image. At least I haven't by modifying these things, although you should play with it and let me know. Your mileage may vary. So that's the gamut mapping side. Tone mapping side, we've got a few more options. You can see I'm on luminance mapping right now. I would encourage you to use any of these bottom three. You could use luminance mapping, DaVinci, or saturation preserving. And you can see I'm getting different reproductions with each of those, But with each of them, I have the very important ability to select a maximum input, a maximum output, and an adaptation, meaning what's the kind of weight, how heavy, how dense, how dark, or how open, how airy, how light, how bright am I going to be in the process of scaling, in this case, 10,000 nits down to 100. And let me go back to this frame I was on here before, and let's actually turn our look back on because it's going to make a bit more of an exaggerated example here. Let's get a look at our character's eyeballs and just quickly compare. You know, if I go between saturation preserving and luminance mapping, they're just different, right? They get you different reproductions. Definitely something I would encourage you to play around with and see what works best for your creative goals. But the important thing here is that when you're working in something like DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, you want to set that max input to 10,000 nits if you're using a manual color space transform, and you want to set that max output to 100. There's really not much play on either side here, because if you go lower than 10,000, you run the risk of clipping something on the input side of the transform. And if you go higher than 100 on this side, you run the risk of clipping something on the output side. And this would change slightly if we were going to, say, 1000 nit ST2084, some kind of HDR flavor. But for SDR, which is what most of us are working in, this is the sensible set of parameters for max input and max output. I would always use the custom, and I would always declare them in that way. And then I would simply play around with, like, okay, is it DaVinci? Is it luminance mapping? Or is it saturation preserving? And play around with the additional parameters that you're given with each until you're getting the reproduction that best works for your creative goals. Kind of a long answer there, but hopefully a helpful primer on those elements of the color space transform.
Let's go back to the OOTF question. I'm using the Aces OpenFX. Does it automatically apply the OOTF? Sometimes I will go to Rec709 to Aces CCT and then back to Rec709.
Good question. So if we are doing, I mean, let's just quickly lab this out. So if the question is, if I'm doing this, there's a lot of items in these drop downs. It's getting a little out of control. I guess it's good to have options. So I believe this is what's being described. Let me go there. Let's see. So 709 to CCT, and then let me just make sure I've got everything else turned off here. So this is not going to give us a sensible visual reproduction because I'm lying. This is not a 709 state image at its input, and I'm going to be outputting back to that same, I'm making a net neutral round trip here. So if this is what's being described, if you're saying you use ACES transforms and you're going Rec709 to ACES CCT, do your thing, and then you go ACES CCT back to Rec709. Yes, that OOTF, that opto-optical transfer function that's going to sort of like weight your mid-gray in an appropriate place for a display is being properly applied or inverted at both of those links in the chain inside of ACES, yes.
Okay, let's go back to DaVinci with Gamut. Could you please demonstrate an example of the process of creating a show LUT for production in DaVinci with Gamut, and how would you apply the LUT in the post-color manage workflow?
Yeah, really good question. We had a number of good questions this week and last, I feel like, about creating show LUTs and about generating LUTs within Resolve and for DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. And to be honest, that's another subject that we could spend not just the rest of this hour on, but we could spend 2 weeks talking about. And in fact, I'm going to spend 2 weeks talking about it in my show LUT design course that I'm teaching with Color Intelligence coming up in March or April. It's coming up in the next couple months here. We'll get you guys a link that you can follow there. We spend a full 2 weeks talking about that subject of like, all right, what are all the considerations? What are the best practices? What are the pitfalls? What are the booby traps? What are the opportunities inherent in the process of saying, hey, I want to make a show LUT. I want to make it for a red, or I want to make it for an Arri, or I want to make it for another vendor, a VFX vendor, to preview their work underneath a LUT that's actually representative of my creative intent with my client, all of these different use cases for making a show LUT. We're going to go in depth on all those topics and all those different applications of LUTs, how they work, how we can create them, and how we can manipulate them skillfully. That's the ideal place to get your knowledge built up on those things, because it's a big subject that really requires, I'll put it to you guys this way. LUTs are plagued by a ton of misinformation because they require just a bit more attention to detail than most of us are ready to give when we're like, I just want something that works. And so we pick up, a couple of like factoids or baseline concepts about LUTs, and then we try to proceed with that limited knowledge. And it's really not enough, especially if you're wanting to create show LUTs. There's a craft to that, and you really need to make a diligent study of it if you want to do it well. So I'm going to suggest for all of you guys who are asking about show LUT creation and show LUT design and doing stuff within DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, go check out that course. We'll leave a link to it, and it'll be our, I think, third or fourth time doing it now, and it's always a blast. It's never the same from one round to another because there's different students in there, but we always have a great time. We always cover a really great range of subjects, and we always have an awesome guest who comes in to educate us. So I'm looking forward to doing the spring installment of that course here in a couple months.
All right, another question. Can we pull keys in scene referred spaces?
Yeah, I saw that one. Great question. Can we pull keys in scene referred spaces? Absolutely. The bigger question that comes right along with it is, should we pull keys in scene referred spaces? And the answer is definitely maybe. There are instances where you want to pull keys. I was on a job this week where I ended up pulling quite a few more keys than I normally would. So the question of like, yeah, absolutely. We can do almost anything when we're color grading. Should, it's a definite maybe. It depends on what your needs are and the way you pull the key. So to give you just a very broad sort of set of principles there, this is again stuff that's coming right out of the Colorist 10 Commandments. If we think about, like where do qualifiers fall in the spectrum of like, if we imagine like the broadest possible tool in DaVinci Resolve, we've already talked about it today. We talked about it very first thing up. Broadest possible manipulation that I can make inside of DaVinci Resolve is offset, right? Offset is literally just arithmetic, adding or subtracting. Just bring the image up, knock the image down, affect all the pixels the same. Don't do anything different depending on what the pixel value is. It's just simple arithmetic, just simple addition and subtraction. If we think about that spectrum, that at the far end of it over here for the broadest is going to be offset, all the way at the other end is going to be something like a qualifier where we would pull a key. At least there's a type of qualifier that would fit that. That would be something like this, where it's like, oh, I am, whatever. I'm just going to tap and select here, like pulling a key where you can see I've got a band of hue, sat, and luma that are being used to constrict and define this key that I'm pulling. This is a very narrow adjustment. This is a very narrow selection of our image. And as I talk about in that chapter of the Colorist 10 Commandments, broad beats narrow. So we always want to be striving when we're grading for the broadest possible solution that gets us what we want. And that holds even with qualifiers. When we're pulling keys, you can use a qualifier. There's no color grading police that are going to come arrest you. I'm not going to, come to your house and tell you shouldn't have done that. Even when you're pulling qualifiers, though, you can be judicious about how you pull those qualifiers. So you guys have seen me talk about this before, but just as an example here, I would try to use 2 rather than 3 of these channels. And if I can get away with 1, that's going to be my preference. And if I can do it with luminance, I'm going to do it with luminance sooner than with sat or hue, because luminance is going to tend to be the cleanest channel of the 3. And then I'm going to try to make my selection as broad and soft as possible. Now, this is all hypothetical because I don't really have something that I'm aimed at right now. Like maybe if I wanted to select this washing machine, you guys can see like when I tap on the washing machine, I'm like, wow, we've done a pretty good job. I would want to now explore how much more broadly can I target this adjustment. So you can see, okay, turns out saturation's not doing anything, so that can just go away. Turns out luminance really isn't doing anything either, so I can get to it just with my hue. And let's see how wide I can go with this hue. Like, okay, that's kind of my width. Let's make sure my center is really in the ideal spot. I can get it even better by going here. And then let's soften things out a little bit like so. And then maybe if I wanted to, I could kick my luminance back on, set my high back to its default, or just set the whole channel back to its default maybe. And then see if I can't sweep up some of that noise in the bottom just with a soft luminance qualifier down here and soften that out like so. So that would be kind of the idea there. Yes, you absolutely can pull qualifiers. We want to use other broader tools if possible. And if not possible, we want to use the qualifier itself as broadly as possible. And you guys can see here, if I compare like, okay, here's the key that I just dialed in like so. And if I compare that to what happened when I just eyedroppered the washing machine, it's that versus that. Much cleaner key here. We can see that, right? And it's going to hold up better on a wider variety of shots because I've made it as simple and broad as possible.
All right. For OTT deliveries, do platforms always require Dolby Vision IMFs? And since they generally want their working gamut not to exceed P3 D65, won't using DaVinci wide gamut cause an issue?
Good question. So in terms of the deliverables piece, I'll put it this way. I've never done a streaming show or any show for that matter where the deliverables were the same or where they weren't very, very explicit about like, hey, here's the list. I need these things from you. So I would say that part's relatively easy. It's just a matter of checking the boxes that are asked. But no, they're not identical. They're not always the same. And no, it's not always a Dolby Vision thing that they want. Sometimes I will push for not doing a Dolby Vision thing if I can get my way and say like, hey, could we do a separate SDR deliverable depending on the show and depending on the version of Dolby Vision they're asking for. So no, it's not a for sure thing that you're going to have to do a Dolby Vision IMF or a particular type of deliverable. It's going to vary with every show. And it just flew right out of my head. There was a second part to that question. Repeat that for me, Rafa.
All right, let me find it again. And since they generally want their working gamut not to exceed P3 D65, right, won't using DaVinci wide gamut cause an issue?
Right. Yeah. So with that one, that's not something I'm familiar with. They're generally, you are probably not going to be asked for a deliverable, a broadcast deliverable or a reproduction deliverable with a bigger gamut than P3D65 because there's not really a display that can hit anything bigger than P3D65. But that's not the same thing as your working gamut. I've never, I'll put it this way just to make an easy example of it. I've never worked on a show where they wouldn't have accepted ACES as the color management framework. Sometimes I have to fight a little bit more to be like, well, I'm actually going to be color managing in an equally sound way, but it's a bit less vanilla. Here's what I'm going to be doing. And it usually takes a bit of dialogue to get everyone comfortable with that. But ACES is like, I've never done a show where ACES wouldn't have been a completely welcome approach to color management, and ACES is way bigger than P3D65. ACES, the AP1 or even more so AP0, those primaries are massive. They're way bigger than P3D65. So the working space can and should be much, much, much larger than any display space. It's just that we want to be targeting, as you mentioned, a display space that is compatible with the displays we're actually going to be viewing this stuff on. Sometimes you'll get requirements with Rec2020 P3 limited, but that's really just P3, just a fancy way of stipulating P3. I think maybe a bit of a confusion of working space versus display or output space there.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. Let's stick with deliveries. What settings do you use to do a web export? Mine are Rec709, Gamma 2.4, and for the web, I set the Colorist space transform to Gamma 2.2 and export with the Rec709 A tag. Is this correct? Could you show us your approach?
Yes, that can be correct. We've talked about this in other episodes of Grade School, and I still have it on my agenda to do another full episode dedicated to this subject because it's hairy. Here's how I would do it. Like, let's say, this project that we've been working on is ready for actual delivery for web. It's kind of going to depend on where it's going, but let me just give you guys the example of this is going to go to YouTube, okay? here's how I would handle this. I'm going out to Rec709 Gamma 2.4. I'm going to leave that as is, depending on how I expect this to be viewed. I may want to go to Rec709 Gamma 2.2, which is just going to add a bit more of contrast, which is going to give us what we call flare compensation. It's to account for the brighter lighting that is going to be surrounding the average viewer looking at this on their laptop or their iPad or whatever, as opposed to me when my suite is in the sort of darkened grading lighting mode that it goes into. So you could potentially target Gamma 2.2. The other thing that I'm going to use here is something that is in that starter pack that we mentioned at the beginning of the session today, is my web transform, which is for YouTube and Frame.io specifically, that is just going to account for a thing that YouTube and Frame.io do when you upload an asset. YouTube and Frame.io are going to introduce just a bit of like sort of an opening or an upward gamma in the bottom end of the image. So this web viewing transform has been calculated to, as tightly as possible, counteract that on a sort of preemptive basis. So if I'm delivering at least to YouTube, I'm going to add this web viewing transform at the very tail of the stack. As I said, this is available for free for you guys to download. The only catch is you sort of have to be color managing in nodes to use it, because we want to add it downstream of our display transform, which isn't normally where we would want to operate. So you need to be operating in nodes, or you would need to output your entire timeline, bring it back into Resolve, and then apply this LUT and re-export, which would be kind of a bummer to have to render twice. But you could do that if you didn't want to switch everything over to a full-on node-based color management after setting up color management in your project settings and grading through an entire shot. So that's how I would handle things in terms of the actual output of the thing. And then in terms of the metadata, which was the other question that we were asked here, the Rec709A thing bugs me a little bit, because this is actually not Rec709A. And I know why we want to use this gamma tag. And you can see, in fact, I've actually already got it selected here, because if we want it to look good, for example, in QuickTime, we sort of need to do that gamma tag for Rec709A. If we don't, it's going to look straight up wrong if someone watches it in QuickTime. The problem is when we do this, we're actually lying, because this image is not Rec709A. This image is Gamma 2.4 or Rec709, same thing. So I try not to game the system unless I have to. Unless I have a client who's saying, I'm going to be reviewing on QuickTime, I try to do this and play this by default. And again, if we go with our sort of hypothetical scenario here where I'm delivering for YouTube, YouTube doesn't care what these tags are, at least for SDR Rec709. I can do my gamma at Rec709, or I can do it at Rec709A. YouTube's not going to change its behavior based on these tags. So you might as well tag them honestly. Again, if you need to use the 709A tag as that hack that you guys may be familiar with that allows you to get the proper reproduction inside of QuickTime, that's not the end of the world, but I would default to trying to actually tag what this is, which is not 709A, but Gamma 2.4, if that makes sense. So those are kind of like my broad principles for web deliverables there. And then, there's really no substitute for this is sort of the rough equivalent of what they would call like the car stereo test if you're making a record. Since it's not going, you really can't plan for it to be reproduced on any particular screen in any particular environment. Grab an iPad, grab a MacBook Pro, grab your phone, and go sit in your living room, go sit in your kitchen, go sit on a park bench outside and just see how things hold up. That's the best we can do when we're delivering for a mixed environment. We have less control. So the best we can do is, use best practices when we are encoding and setting metadata, and then take a look at the fruits of our work and make sure that it feels as consistent as we can get it across all those different screens and viewing conditions.
All right. Michael Keikov is asking, what is the best way to set up color management on an iMac that has a P3 color space? Should I just monitor Rec709?
Yeah, this is a good question that touches on, it sort of relates to a number of questions I've been getting lately. So here's what I'm going to encourage you guys to do. This is kind of a bummer, but the truth is you cannot master for any color space. I don't care if it's P3, Rec709, like anything else in between, you can't master for a color space. At least I'm not ever going to like give you the thumbs up to master for a color space without a dedicated reference monitor being fed by a proper video card. There's just not really a way to do it because there's too many links in the chain. There's too much OS level color management. And even, like the P3 thing, that's just a number that, that's just a claim, I should say, that is being made by Apple when they talk about that iMac. And oftentimes when you read about displays that claim P3, if you look at the fine print, they say hits 97% of P3 or 94% of P3 or 99% of P3. That doesn't mean anything. Like if you tell me you're hitting 97% of P3, that's like telling me, like you're Evel Knievel and you're going to jump the Grand Canyon and you made it 97% over the Grand Canyon. Doesn't help much. You didn't make it, So we first of all want to make sure that the display can actually hit P3. And the only way to do that is to calibrate it and get it measured. And that means it needs to actually be able to receive an input signal, not from a, like a PC or a Mac, but a line level like HDMI or SDI feed. So I know it's kind of a sobering truth to hear like, oh, I thought my iMac that claims P3, I could use to master P3. Unfortunately, that's just not a very good practice and it's going to give you headaches. You need to get a dedicated reference monitor, and whether that reference monitor can do 709 or P3 or something else, get a dedicated reference monitor, feed it properly with a signal from a dedicated card, and take the guesswork out of the equation because there's enough as is. Even then, you're still going to have to get that display calibrated. And even then, you're going to have to deal with the fact that no other display is actually going to be calibrated or be hitting a standard. So the elements that we can control, our display and the way that it's fed, become all the more important when we're talking about releasing something into the wild where we have zero control. So I would say for the iMac, if you don't have that external reference display, I don't mean to beat up on you or say like, oh, you shouldn't be grading without that. But I will say, use Rec709 and, like you're going to want to go more by your scopes and by sound color management framework than by what you're seeing. You really are not going to be able to trust what you see, and you're really not going to want to push things very far because your eyes are going to lie to you, or that screen is going to lie to you sooner or later. So what I would do is set up good sound color management, target Rec709 because you know that display can hit 100% of Rec709. You don't know if it can hit 100% of P3. And trust your color management framework and trust your scopes and take what you're seeing with a grain of salt because you recognize that you are not looking at a properly calibrated image.
Okay, let's stick in the screen topic. Hence, the colorist wants to know if you do a remote grade, how do you share the reference monitor with your client?
Good question. I'll give you my answer to that. I have a bundle of iPad Pros that I bought in early 2020. I've got 3 of them that I have taken to my calibration professional. I don't calibrate myself because it's a whole black art unto itself, and the equipment and the knowledge that you have to acquire in order to do it well is daunting, and I've got other pursuits. So I took those iPads to my calibration professional. And what we did is we profiled end to end. I'm like, hey, I want to run live sessions over Zoom with my clients, and I want them to see what I'm seeing. So we ran an end-to-end profile of the iPad, accounting for the entire signal chain of saying, okay, I'm going to go line level out from my video card on my local machine, and then I'm going to feed that into a capture card. That's going to be read in as a camera into my Zoom. That's going to get broadcast out over the Zoom session and ultimately be received into this iPad, which I will ship to my client for their sessions. Let's see how the two compare. Let's see how well the iPad is hitting the spec and bring it in line where it's not. So that was my solution there, at least for color critical stuff where I'm like, I need to know. I don't do that for every session, but for clients that decline and say, oh, we don't need that, or we don't have time for you to ship it, let's just do it, we've got our MacBooks or whatever, I always sort of like start those conversations with the same caveat and say, okay, that's totally cool. You're going to get a reasonable looking image on your side. It's not going to look insane, but you're going to have to lean on me a little bit more and trust that not just my hands and eyes have had more practice at this stuff, but what I'm using to view your image is more meaningful than what you are using to view your image. So you're going to have to trust me a little bit more. That's kind of my pitch when we are doing remote sessions and there is not one of my calibrated iPads on the other end of that, is I say like, look, I can't know exactly what you're looking at. And all I can tell you is that it's not going to be super tightly calibrated. So you're going to have to trust me a bit more. But that's kind of how I've chosen to solve that for my clients.
Okay, let's go to grading. Root Cinemas is asking, for white balance, is it always good to start with offset? Could you demonstrate the different stuff to do the white balance?
Let's hold that one in suspense, because this coming week, our next video, we're going to talk all about color balance, and I want to give that one the full attention it deserves, and then we'll talk about any follow-up questions in the next episode of Grade School.
All right. So Thomas Berglunti, something like that. What happens to the color gamut when exporting, an example, Arri White Gamut LogC Pro Res 4444 as a flat file from Premiere Pro that only supports Rec709 or Rec2100 as working color space?
I don't actually know. It should be nothing. Unless Premiere is getting super extra and actually clipping values, should be nothing. Even if it's saying, oh, you know, like we only support these color spaces, there should be a way within Premiere. I don't use Premiere, so I can't tell you definitively. Although I do certainly take plenty of flat renders of LogC Arri Wide Gamut material from Premiere editors that they still have the full gamut of what was acquired on set. It should be nothing. You should be able to say, hey, you see these values that came in, at this and this point, just leave them the hell alone. Don't do anything to them. Don't clip, don't clamp, don't transform, don't manage. Just leave them alone. Off the top of my head, I don't know exactly if you need to do something special or what that something special would be to get Premiere to do that. But I am quite confident that there's a way to do that in Premiere so that it is not manipulating your effective gamut or clipping or clamping things to fall within 709 or 2020 or 2100 just by virtue of being exported. It's just a question of what exact switches need to be flipped or don't need to be flipped in order to get that result.
Can you show us how to use your exposure chart, please?
Yeah, let's take a look at the exposure chart. So this is a tool that I would use for, I use it for a number of different things, but, like if let's just go here into like, let's use it to audition right now. I've got my pipeline in Nodes. It's the same pipeline that we did in the pre-recorded video for this subject. It just happens to be in Nodes as opposed to being iterated in my project settings. So I've got my end-to-end pipeline right now, taking me from Arri LogC all the way out to Rec709 Gamut 2.4. So one thing that I could do is if I add a serial node after my input and I find my exposure chart, which will be buried somewhere among all of my goodies here. Oh, you know what? I forgot. I need to make that happen. Hang tight 1 second here, guys. So we're going to say, where is my exposure chart? Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain here. Okay, that's fine for now. I'm actually going to have to relaunch my Resolve. And let's try all that again. So once I pull up this exposure chart, what I'm going to use it for is to audition, okay, what am I doing to my working color space, or to my working tone curve, I should say? How many stops above and below middle gray am I keeping, or am I sort of rolling together? Like, what's happening to my overall tone curve and my dynamic range as I apply my look, and then ultimately as I apply my display transform? It can be really helpful to see my exposure chart where things are being iterated out in steps, exposure steps that is, and look at the way that various operations are affecting that exposure chart. See if Resolve wants to launch for us this time. I hope everybody's seen Phantom Thread, which is what you see there on my desktop. I just rewatched it the other day. What a beautiful movie. One of my favorites of Paul Thomas Anderson's, and I have many favorites of his movies. Highly recommend it. Okay, let's take a look at this exposure chart. The reason I had to relaunch here is a fun idiosyncrasy of DCTL is for interactive DCTLs like this one. Whenever there's one that has been brought online that wasn't online, you actually have to restart the whole works. So let's turn everything off for a moment. So right now, I've got my chart pulled up. I'm going to specify that I'm in DaVinci Intermediate because here in this node, I've mapped into DaVinci Intermediate. So all I have right now is my boring exposure chart. And if we take this down to its simplest form and even turn off this ramp, all I'm looking at here is a patch of middle gray in DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, okay? I'm not mapping that middle gray out to anything else. I'm just looking at DaVinci Intermediate in mid gray, all right? And if I wanted to look at, let's say I want to look at, I don't know, 4 stops above and below mid gray. No matter how I set my stops, I'm going to have my mid gray in the middle, and then I'm going to have 1, 2, 3, 4 below, and in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4 off to the left, right? And you can see right now, I've got all 9 of these stops are very easily discernible to me, right? I can see the transition between each of them. And let's just look at what happens as I first apply my tone. Okay, so my tone is preserving those things nicely, even though it is compressing highlights and shadows. And then my palette really should have no effect at all because that's only colorimetry. And then let's look at my 709 transform. And I can see, okay, I'm still just able to discern the difference between 3 and 4 stops above mid-gray here. And I can kind of keep cranking this up and see how many stops above mid-gray can I actually perceive when I'm running through my pipeline, which includes an output transform and an overall look. That's kind of one of the things that I could use to evaluate my pipeline with. I could use this exposure chart rather to evaluate my pipeline with. We could also use it just as a quick reference point for if I go back down to a single step, I can look at, okay, where does, I don't know why my whole UI got reset here, but I could look at, all right, where in DaVinci Intermediate does middle gray, 18% gray, where does that plot? I can see this little tooth right here that's going to show me, let me turn all these things off. Here's where my middle gray plots inside of DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. Let's just turn on a reference here. And we can see that that's right around 345. I know from memory it's actually 343. So a couple things that we could use the exposure chart for, but it's basically a way of auditioning a step chart. It's you know, like if we envision a perfectly photographed step chart that someone shoots for you that's got perfectly incremented even stops above and below middle gray in whatever tone curve you want. That's really the merit, is so that we have this perfect piece of test material that we can evaluate whatever processes we wish to on top of it and see like, okay, here's what's happening here. Another really common one is, let's say I am drawing my own contrast curve. Okay. Let's just say, like, I'm just going to kind of freehand a little contrast curve here. Let's turn my output transform back on for the moment and just do something that I feel like looks decent. So, you know, whatever, like maybe that's a little aggressive, but maybe it's what I'm into, who knows? So let's say I'm drawing a tone curve here. If I was building this look, something that I would absolutely use this exposure chart for, in this case, I would actually move it after the look, and I would use this to evaluate, or actually I take that back, I would leave it right where it was, and I would use it to evaluate, okay, what does this do to my mid-gray? So you can see it's moving my mid-gray down a little bit. Probably not something I want for a macro level look. So within this context, I could go back over to here, and maybe easiest thing to do would be to just option click where I see that tooth and leave a unity position so that now when I flip off and on, I should be very closely matching my original middle gray point there, like so. It's moving a little bit, but that would be another thing I would use the exposure chart for quite often, is to pin my mid gray at the desired point, or to set, you know, like the bottom of my curve. If I wanted to say, you know, like let's do 7 stops and say I want to have my, let's say 11 stops. Let's say I want my brightest portion to be over here. I could go over to my curve and I could tap that point and say, okay, I want everything to roll off right there. Like so. Just a nice sort of objective way of looking at the different tonal ranges and exposure steps within the image inside of whatever tone curve you are working in. And for those of you guys who don't know, this tool is available for free. The link will be in the description. It's part of that starter pack that I mentioned at the start of our conversation today, and it's also available as an individual download. It's totally free, and you can download it and use it for these type of tasks. And we got time for a couple more here.
Okay, let's stick with your beautiful tools. 3D movie production wants to know if I use your DaVinci White Gamut 2383 in a non-DaVinci White Gamut workflow, is it enough to change the node color space and gamma to DaVinci White Gamut and then apply it? Or do I need to make our beautiful sandwich, color space transform sandwich?
You should be able to just do so the question is this: if we want to use, let's say we've got an image, like let's tweak our workflow here for a moment. Let's say instead of working in DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, we're working in Arri LogC, which you guys have seen me do plenty of in the past. So right now I'm just tweaking my color management pipelines so that instead of working in DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, I'm coming in as Arri LogC. And I'm going out from Arri LogC to Rec709 Gamut 2.4. And let's say that within this pipeline, I want to use my 2383. So the question is, could I simply right click here and set my color space to DaVinci Wide Gamut and DaVinci Intermediate, like so? The question that I can never remember how to answer off the top of my head is it's all about order of operations. If under the hood, this LUT is being applied in between the sandwich of transforms from DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate to, or from Arri LogC to DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, and then back from there to LogC LogC, that should work. And I think that's going to be the case. If I set my timeline color space appropriately here for it to reflect this new workflow, that should be the case. I've set this to DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. Oh, I see. I set that to Cineon. That might be why. So let's just do a quick test and find out. So if I grab a still of this where I am just tagging this node as DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, and I am applying the LUT on that node, here's the result that we get, and we've saved a still of it. And now let's just very quickly audition doing it with a color space transform sandwich, where we're going to say Arri Alexa, Arri LogC, DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate. And then we're going to turn this all off. We don't need any of these pieces like we've talked about. And then we're going to do the opposite on the other side. Say DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate, Arri Alexa, Arri LogC, and moment of truth, let's apply our LUT onto this middle node. And let's see if we get a dead match, which we do. So that's the answer to our question. Yes, you can do that. You can simply retag within your nodes and get sensible results. The only caveat that I would throw out there, I'll throw 2 caveats very quickly. First of all, if you are moving from a, well, that first one I'll leave alone. I was going to talk about moving from a larger space, moving from a space larger than DaVinci Wide Gamut, but there actually really isn't one that you could have. So you're safe on that front. The only other thing that I will mention is when this 2383 was built, it was built underneath or expecting a color space transform, a resolve color management display mapping. So depending on this pipeline that you're using, which may or may not be exactly what I was using in the pre-recorded video, if you're using a different output transform, you may be rendering the image in a different fashion than I intended when I built the look. And as a result, you might get a different reproduction. So that would just kind of be the one caveat. Like, easy example, if for some reason you were at the end of everything using aces to get from Alexa out to Rec709, okay, I mean, that still works, but this no longer represents the image that I saw when I was building this LUT, if that makes sense. So you just want to be mindful of matching the output display transform that that the LUT is intended for as well. Even though there is no output display transform in there, if it uses a different one than I was looking at when I built this LUT, you're not going to see what I saw and what I said. Cool, my guys are going to love this LUT. So you kind of are going to be flying at your own risk at that point. Let's do one more.
Okay. Regarding the lesson, DaVinci White Gamut and Aces, recently I experienced hard clipping on the shadows when using DaVinci White Gamut with vlog footage. However, that doesn't really happen in Aces. Did you experience such issues with DaVinci White Gamut?
I have not experienced that. It wouldn't be the craziest thing in the world to me to learn that perhaps the input transform for vlog within Resolve Color Management is somehow like improperly implemented, or the implementation is broken in some way. That sounds to me like what the culprit would be there, because you should not, theoretically, vlog should be, you should be able to fully contain a vlog dynamic range inside of DaVinci Intermediate, and then from there, the path forward should be the same as with any other material. So I haven't run across that myself, but to be honest, I've created maybe one or two vlog things in the last couple of years, so I haven't had much exposure to it. But that's certainly possible that you are experiencing that a problematic input mapping there. And in terms of like the ideal way to work around that, I'm not so sure, except to begin by doing some rigorous testing. In fact, you could, do we have vlog in the exposure chart? Let's find out. Where are you? We do. So one way that we could test that is if we look at our color space transform and we say we're going to go, the color space side doesn't matter, but filling it in anyway. Let's say I'm just going to map from vlog into DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. I don't need any tone mapping, hopefully. And I'm going to go to my waveform down here so I can kind of see things constructed in a ramp. And let's just go to, like, I don't know what the claimed stop range on vlog is. It's probably somewhere around 16 or 18. So if we look here, it doesn't look like we're getting any hard clipping as a result of this operation. Looks like it's holding up okay. Let's turn these things off. You know, I've kind of, it looks like I've hit just about the upper limit of the image there, but it doesn't look like we're getting any hard clipping in the shadows. It looks like they're just being like compressed appropriately down into the bottom. But this is something you could use the exposure chart for, is to compare, like, all right, so can I get a reproduction on the exposure chart of what I'm seeing when I do an input mapping from vgamut vlog using a color space transform versus using ACES. And going into, you know, whatever, ACES CCT. Is there something in the shape of these curves? I don't expect them to match, but is there something in the shape of these curves that would explain that? I don't see anything at first blush, first examination there, but that would be, this could be potentially a useful tool for exploring, like, all right, is what I'm seeing real, or is it the result of something else in my pipeline? And like, what actually is happening? Is there some kind of clipping taking place in the shadows? You could make kind of a science experiment out of it if you wanted to. All right, guys, that's a lot of stuff that we covered today. I hope you got the chance to get your question answered and get some blanks filled in on this workflow of, you know, DaVinci Wide Gamut and kind of doing things from scratch. We're going to continue, obviously, with this workflow. We've got several more installments in the series, and hopefully if you didn't get your question answered today, you can get it covered in the next round of grade school, or I will cover it along the way in the pre-recorded videos as we continue to build up our knowledge and skill on implementing a DaVinci Wide Gamut workflow for really, really effective grading and for getting great images out of that process. So really good to see you guys all again. I missed y'all. Glad to be back with you. Hope you enjoyed getting to hang out and do some grade schooling and the new format this morning. So it was fun for me to get to stay focused on this one task and dive deep on it. And I'm looking forward to continuing the series with you guys. Let me know if you have any other questions on this, and we can try to roll them into the next grade school next week. Other than that, you guys have an awesome weekend, an awesome week. Enjoy next week's video, and we'll see you back here next week to answer any follow-up questions from that video when we get to Friday. Thanks to Rafa for co-hosting with me. See you guys all very soon.